Howdy and welcome back. Go ahead and continue our discussion here on error handling, runtime error handling, by discussing the kinds of exceptions that the standard library exception facility provides for us. We'll see here that there's kind of a family of exceptions that we can use through our program to communicate different exceptional situations to the user in the event that they arise. So all of these exceptions kind of have a parent, and that's going to be this standard library exception. You will not be able to throw an STD exception here. And we'll get into why that is when we start to talk about inheritance in abstract base classes. But right now, just understand that you're not going to be able to do this. Instead, you're going to have to use one of its descendants or children. We'll see here that we can throw an STD, logic error, and that all of these exceptions have some sort of string that can be passed to describe the exceptional case that has arose. So that's totally valid, throwing an STD. Runtime error, again, is completely valid. If we want to be more descriptive, we can go ahead and throw one of the either logic error or runtime errors children. Here's the cool thing about this. So let's say, I don't know, maybe we have a out of range issue error here. So we go ahead and throw STD out of range and say, I don't know, index is not valid. So when we get into our try block, wherever that is, and then our catch, corresponding catch, our exception handler, we could either catch a STD out of range, or alternatively, had we specified that we would catch a standard library logic error, essentially specifying that, sorry, the handwriting's so legible here. I'm trying to hold this up now, so I'm not like staring over, and I realize it's weird writing like this, but okay. Here's the takeaway. Not my problem with writing, but if we specify that an exception handler to catch a logic error, it will catch any of logic error's children. Okay? So just understand that implication. The exception handlers are going to flow top down. So if you had a, say, catch out of range error followed by a catch logic error, in that order, the out of range error would be executed. That exception handler block would be executed in this case. If that ordering was reversed and the logic error came before the exception handler for the out of range, the logic error's exception handling would go ahead and partake. So let me pull up some code to show you how this works. Okay, so in my VS Code, to make a point here, I'm going to go ahead and have my exception, specify an exception handler that will catch a standard library logic error. In my definition of area rectangle, I'm going to throw in the case of a negative area calculation an invalid argument exception. This should probably have in reality been thrown in the case that either width or height contained an invalid argument, and then specifying which one of those parameters were initialized with a negative value. But for the purposes of the illustration here, I'm going to not necessarily follow best practice and help walk you through to understand how these exceptions are propagated and what the ordering of the exception handler means in terms of how they will be handled. So if I go ahead and execute this code with an invalid argument to area, notice here, let me clear this up so you can see it. Because my invalid argument is a descendant of logic error, it will be caught if I'm looking for a logic error. Essentially, this is an umbrella and it will catch any of the exceptions that fall under it if specified. Now let's go ahead and say I wanted to specifically catch an invalid argument error. And then if some other logic error arose, I'd like maybe a out of range, I'd go ahead and handle that by the actual logic error handler. But I wanted to handle this one specifically on its own and independent of those other potential cases. Notice that in this case, we're still going into the logic error handler. And the reason being is that when this exception gets thrown, when we look at the handlers that can go ahead and handle the exception, the first best match in top-down order is that which will be executed. In this case, the first best match where we could actually handle the exception was the standard library logic error, because an invalid argument error is a standard logic error, and that's the code that was executed. Now, because this does flow top down in the order in which the exception handlers are analyzed, had we gone ahead and put the invalid argument handler first, when we come back and when we were to begin processing the handlers looking for a match, this is what would be compared against the object that was thrown first. In this case, we would have a match of this type of exception thrown here, and we would go ahead and execute the corresponding code for this exception handler. Now, if a out of range exception was thrown from area rectangle, that is a logic error. It would not match with our invalid argument error, but it would match with the logic error here, because an STD out of range is essentially falls under the standard library logic error umbrella. So going ahead and just illustrating this, notice here we threw the invalid argument exception. We began processing the exception handlers available to us. The first one was a match. In that case, we went in, we executed the code block associated with it, and then we picked up right where we left off. So we were here, and then we hit that. We had already handled the exception. So program flow would then pick up or jump from line 14 to line 19, and we'd continue processing. And the error in this case was handled. So that's a little bit about the kinds of exceptions defined for us in this standard exception library. I talked a little bit about how they're kind of a hierarchy, how say there's different flavors of exceptions, different flavors of logic errors, and then discuss some of the implications in actually handling those when they're thrown. We'll now move into a brief discussion about preconditions and postconditions before finishing up today's lesson.